Hi, friends. I'm really excited to introduce you to Dr. Dent Gitchell, an educator, author, and meditation teacher, a guy with a lot of credentials and a lot of expertise. But what I just recently learned about him is that he's been a fan of the Grateful Dead since he was young. And along with that came a lot of consciousness expanding experiences with psychedelics. In this conversation with Dent, we'll dive into those early experiences and how they've shaped the wise and kind teacher he's become. To learn more about Dent, check out the links in the show notes. For a list of all my free courses on Buddhism, see the show notes too. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dent Gitchell. Well, Dent, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your wisdom and your stories and your experiences and your love of the Grateful Dead with this audience. And I should say, you've mentioned that you have, that long ago, you had some experiences with psychedelics. I've only ever known you in the Buddhist context. And I'm super curious to hear, how did you get into psychedelics? What was the background of that for you?
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, which I'll shorten. Well, my experience with psychedelics is largely affiliated with my exposure and experience as a fan of the Grateful Dead, which encompassed quite a few years of my life, really looking back on it, 10 to 12 years of my life.
Starting at what age?
Yeah, I'll give a backstory going into that. I was sort of, for whatever reason, a child, adolescent, young adult who was kind of always searching for something. But I didn't have any reference point to really know where to go with my search. My parents didn't go to church, and so they'd sort of withdrawn from particular religious perspectives that had grown up in. So I had really no reference point for where to look, and my parents were very open just to be yourself and go find yourself kind of thing, which is great. And the summer after 10th grade, I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. I went to a boarding school in what was it called? Andover in Massachusetts. And that was like a huge deal for me. 16 years old from Little Rock, flying by myself to Boston, and this guy across the room, not a guy, he was a college student. He was like the dorm guy who overlooked people, the RA or something. And he was like sophomore, and he had like kind of long curly hair, and he listened to the Grateful Dead all the time. And I just thought he was the coolest person in the world. His name was Lenny. I would like to figure out who he was. I don't remember his last name. And then there was
approximately what year was this?
This would have been 1983.
Okay.
In the summer of 83. And at that time I was listening to a lot of like Crosby, Stills and Nash and Simon and Garfunkel. For whatever reason, I was really tuned into the kind of late 60s, early 70s.
Well, the Grateful Dead, I was like, is this a 60s story? Yeah, but you're not that old.
Yeah, they were like started in 65 and were going very strong then, but they weren't on my radar. That wasn't like, I'd never heard of them, maybe, reading an article or something. My dad had a whole bunch of albums, like 800 albums or something. He's a musician and spent from the 50s up through, contemporary stuff, no Grateful Dead stuff, but I listened to a lot of what you would call hippie music, Woodstock, Crosby, Stills and Nash, James Taylor, Paul Simon, just on and on. And so I really had an affinity to that music and this sort of longing that like these people like knew something or something that I wanted. There was a sense of freedom there or something. And so this guy Lenny was listening to the Grateful Dead, and this other guy who was there as a student came with like this big box of tapes. They were Grateful Dead tapes, and they would just sit there and talk, and I would listen to them. And I was like, I want in on this kind of thing. And to shorten the story, I went back to school and discovered cannabis and some other things. And somewhere along the line, one of my friends had Grateful Dead tapes, and the backstory is the Grateful Dead kind of bombed on all their studio albums, but they encouraged people to tape their shows. They were kind of the originators of social media in a certain way. They had this newsletter, so they communicated directly with their fans, and there was this huge underground circulation of live music tapes. And so I met a few friends, we started listening, that kind of thing. And then I went off and had a few exposures to LSD during that time, like after my senior year, I think that summer. And, started wearing tie-dyes and this kind of thing. back then it was pre-internet, and there was one record store in town, and I bought some Grateful Dead cassettes at that time. That's what I was listening to, and then had collected it, but you couldn't get the bootlegs unless you knew somebody. And so I didn't know how to, and I didn't have the technology to even make a tape to tape back then. That's how, it seems like a different world it was. Anyhow, I went to school, and I was at Columbia University in New York City. And in my dorm, literally like the first week I was there was a sign that said Grateful Dead tickets.
Welcome home, Dent.
And so I like bought like for 3 nights at Madison, at the Meadowlands, which was across the river in New Jersey. And I met this girl in the dorm and invited her. Got on the subway, and it was just full of people with tie-dyes, and they're all like, man, and 2 nights ago in Richmond they played Morning Dew, and I knew the songs a little bit, and they were kind of going, and I was like, wow, this is like, the subway was just full. And then I went to Port Authority, where you take buses, and took a bus to the Meadowlands, and the whole thing was just a party. And for whatever reason, I had an extra ticket. I can't, memory's a little hazy, but I remember getting off the bus, and it was just like a circus, like a carnival, like what I think of as like a medieval bazaar or something from Morocco. And I haven't traveled there, but just like a world I'd never encountered.
Yeah.
And there's people holding up one finger, which is like meaning they're wanting a ticket. And there's this whole culture of giving people tickets. Sometimes I was not in on all of that, because you have to kind of experience it. And so I like gave this guy a ticket, and he just like hugged me for like 5 minutes and was jumping around, and I was like, wow. And I got on the bus, that's what we call it, and went for 3 nights, and ended up not finishing my school at Columbia and taking, I always call it a sabbatical now, for 3 or 4 years. And I was pretty well homeless in a sense, but lived on the road, went to maybe 200 Grateful Dead concerts.
Wow.
All over the country.
I just want to clarify, when you say got on the bus, does that mean like took acid?
Well, that was part of it pretty well, but the bus meant like you're on like this. In the 60s, there was a bus, Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. They had a group called the Merry Pranksters, and they had a bus called Further that traveled around the country. And Ken Kesey, and the lyricist of the Grateful Dead was a guy named Robert Hunter. And there was the beat culture was really big in San Francisco, the Bay Area, in the 50s. And in the late 50s, they were doing LSD. It wasn't illegal. The LSD studies, recruiting participants to, I don't know, they give you a bunch of LSD and like ask you a bunch of questions. I don't know what they did, but Robert Hunter and Ken Kesey were 2 of the early people in those experiments. And then it all began to circulate through the beat community. And this is kind of pre-hippies. And so Further was the name of the bus. And so On the Bus just became a term for jumping on the sort of Grateful Dead train.
Okay.
Like
Okay.
a turn.
Thank you.
It's like once you're on the bus, are you on the bus or not, kind of thing. Or I went to a concert, now I'm on the bus.
Okay. So you're on the bus, and now you're basically kind of homeless and just following the Grateful Dead around the country.
Like after I sort of quit going to Columbia, I was going to take a break, or that's a whole different story. And then a friend of mine was like, come on tour with us this spring. This is 87. And that's when I went with a group of people, and I was really on the bus, I would guess 87 through about 1990.
Wow.
And traveling around, and psychedelics was very much part of that culture, and for better and worse. I'm not like promoting. There was some definitely a lot of casualties along the way, and but it was mind-blowing in every sense of the word, and my sense of reality was totally just obliterated and smashed. And I came out of that wanting to study philosophy and physics, and I encountered Buddhism, but they all came out of this just being exposed to things that I didn't know were possible, and really questioning everything, but also insights that meant there's more to reality than what they're telling us, in a sense, whoever this they is, but like there's more out there than we even have a clue about. And there was something about the music and the concerts that it sometimes was magical, spiritual. Joseph Campbell, who went in 87, said it was the return of Dionysus to the West. And he said he had never seen such much pure bliss in a group of people. So there was, it's a big story, and it's just emerging now, the second sort of renaissance, I think, of people who are more clear-headed. A lot of the sort of bad drugs and things are out of out of people's systems. And there's a lot of interest in resuscitation of the music, and that's not really what we're talking about now, but that's so part of the culture. And LSD was largely proliferated through that culture, including their sound system. They had state-of-the-art sound systems that were created by this guy named Owsley Stanley, who, this is like way ahead of their time. They were crystal clear electronics in the early 70s, and he was one of the major persons who made acid and distributed it. In the early days, there was these things called the acid tests. This is when it was still legal. Ken Kesey and his people, it was basically this free form art thing where a bunch of people gathered and just people did art. And the Grateful Dead, when they were like 19, 20 years old or whatever, became the house band for that somehow. So that's where they began. So the whole, from there to, and they would take LSD and practice like all night for like weeks at a time, and developed all these complicated rhythms and things. And just really, when you take LSD in a group setting, you really sort of lose your sense of identity in a sense, and can sort of get a group mind kind of thing going on. So that sort of mentality carried through to the larger audience and the culture.
I had no idea their music was kind of coming from, like group LSD experiences.
It came from the acid test. They were the house band, and yeah. So there was, and then there was also the government was following the Deadhead scene, and they had fake people trying to arrest people and infiltrating with their own LSD. So the whole thing was just a big, crazy world that evolved just on its own, really, because there was really no one leading it. It just sort of happened. And Jerry Garcia died in 1995. So, the last days weren't real. It got too big. And like all these people were coming just to kind of party, and it turned into just a big monster, basically, in the last like 5 years, probably. But before, in 1987, they had a big hit. So it was really kind of under the radar. It was like this traveling group of crazy circus. There's this one of their songs, "When the Circus Comes in Town," and then then local people and doctors and lawyers. I mean, we're everywhere now, but it was just this sort of multi-layered culture that would look like a cult from the outside, except there's no leader, no credo. The certain credos that sort of evolved were sort of a hippie credo of do whatever you want, but take care of one another and be kind. So that it's really interesting. It's sort of the hippie sort of ethos.
Yeah.
Largely embedded, even though it was a very anti-authoritarian, and like they gave their music away, and they sort of shunned. They created their own sort of musical company and shunned all the big business stuff and got out of contracts. And so it was, and there was a certain sense that they were on the same level as us. They didn't act like rock stars. You could actually write them letters, that kind of thing. And if you I never ran into them, but I, had new friends that if you ran into them, they would just talk to you and that kind of thing. So there was a sense,
like bodyguards and
ultimately they had to have that kind of stuff, but like they had their own newsletter, and this is pre-social media. They communicated directly with their fans rather than through like the large marketing companies. And at that time, the whole marketing music business was based on album sales, and concerts were intended to promote the album sales. And theirs was the flip. It was about the live performances, which were never the same. That's another sort of thing that kept people coming.
So it sounds like, for me to try and understand what your experience was at that time, it sounds like it wasn't just any one of these elements. Like it was the whole scene of like the LSD, but the group experience and the music. And, it sounds like a really incredible confluence of different like ways of opening up to a larger world.
Yeah. And then the particular LSD experiences, I mean, I did a lot compared to like, if you read a book, like how much you should do, or enough to need to go to a psychiatrist. I used to joke with friends, like, if they knew how much, if I told a psychiatrist what I did, they'd go lock me up or something. Because like, and there was liquid acid. It was like the big thing, like really pure acid. And, we would do a lot, I'll put it that way, regularly. And, you can get pretty out there.
Yeah.
When you're embedded in the culture, it doesn't feel like it. Then suddenly you're like, you have to come into quote regular culture, and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm like kind of not even in the same wavelength as people.
Yeah. Like, what were some of the experiences that you had? I mean, I've heard on high doses, you can really like have a complete dissolution of the ego and stuff.
Yeah, it can go in many directions, some of which aren't necessarily positive. And I've thought a lot about this. And first, I have to say, it's been many, many years since I've done psychedelics. So I'm not, one, it's illegal, and I'm sort of like a regular guy who has a job and stuff, so I don't do illegal things. And
Right.
and anyhow, what was the question?
Like, what were
Oh,
some
what
of
are
the experiences that you
oh
had?
oh my gosh, on high doses, like I've thought a lot about what is a delusion
Mm,
or hallucination, and what is opening up the portals of reality.
mm-hmm,
And both of those occur. In Buddhism, the mind is more than what we think of as just like this thinking thing.
mm-hmm.
And it opens you up to your mind. And if you don't have a reference point for what that is, it's pretty big.
So mind, I'm hearing like ultimate mind, like Buddha nature type of mind.
Well,
Like if our
more just,
conceptual mind is one thing, this is something much larger.
yeah, type of mind that's one, there's just an opening to things that are just mind-boggling in a sense of perceptually, and feelings of maybe being one with the cosmos or the earth.
Mm,
Um, and then there's a certain group mind that can occur
mm,
in groups, such as a Grateful Dead concert. You get that many people and that particular type of music that they sort of created. And Jerry Garcia, who in my mind was some sort of bodhisattva or something,
mm.
who
And
had this,
Bodhisattva, for those who don't know, is like a great being in Buddhism, somebody very close to awakening.
I don't want to get into all his downfalls as a human as well, heroin and other things that, in my mind, he was doing Tonglen in a non taking on some of that darkness so we could all learn from it, perhaps. But
Mm-hmm.
that's another story, perhaps. I mean, I've seen him cry tears of blood, I'll put it that way. And
Mm,
he could bring you to a ballad. So in Ellis, you'd just be out there in the swirl of the universe, and then suddenly this soft voice, he would just sing a ballad that would just like bring you back to reality and earth and sadness. His
mm.
father drowned to death in front of him when he was like 5.
Ah,
He had his finger cut off in some sort of accident as a kid. He had a very interesting upbringing, kind of semi on the streets of San Francisco. And so I really think he was tapped into the pain of the world, but also the
mm,
joys. And that's just my own sort of thing that I won't go into. But so there was like this group experience, and there was this musical experience. And then there was something about him as a person that was special, like the type of person who walked in a room. But it was special, not like a rock star, like he wore ratty, like those cotton sweatpants like people wore in the 70s and 80s. And he would wear like
mhm,
the equivalent now of like black Velcro tennis shoes and like a long t-shirt, and he smoked cigarettes. Like he was very unassuming. And
mm,
but there was something about his soul that would come through
mm,
the LSD experience. And people get that experience not on psych, but it was such a large part of the whatever. It just opened you up to so much.
mhm.
Sometimes you could see the music.
Whoa, that sounds cool.
And there was a certain way that you could see it in the group. And then one of their lyrics is when the music played the band.
Mm,
And then as an audience, it felt like you were playing the music. It was like it
mm,
was this totally synchronous experience that was happening, and nobody was really in charge of it. And they knew that in the interviews, that there was a lot of power there, and it scared them. So they made a conscious decision not to manipulate it. They wouldn't like make speeches or
mm,
talk or anything. uh, they knew there was something there. And I call it the the it
mhm,
factor, or whatever, when it happened.
mhm,
um,
mhm,
so my experience with psychedelics is largely affiliated with that particular culture and the experiences coming out of it. And the LSD and others, substances, but primarily LSD was kind of the main. When the ecstasy came on the scene in the late 80s. And there were other DMT and things that I never experienced, and mushrooms were around quite a bit. but primarily LSD. It was part of the culture. And
During that,
I could talk for hours about just that, but
I have so many questions about like all of it, basically. I'm just kind of wondering, during this time, like during the peak experiences when, you're using these psychedelics or just, just being there for the experience, what was the world like to you? I mean, how did you experience yourself and the world around you?
well, sometimes it was like pure bliss and connection. Sometimes it was just being stripped, have this experience now, sometimes in meditation, not like in a practice of meditation, but after like 6 months or something, maybe this whole like being aware that, oh my gosh, this whole thing I've been doing has been my ego kind of thing, and just like this identity dissolution or something. It's like, oh my gosh, just more of a clear seeing of who I am. And part of that is very painful because it's like this whole other story that I've been living by is like not real. So sometimes there was a sense of like skeletons are a very big in that Grateful Dead iconography, just being stripped down to the bone and what's left. So there was a sense of coming out cleansed sometimes, of just being obliterated in a sense of all the things you thought you were and you thought society was, which can be very scary. So sometimes it was very enlightening, sometimes very scary, and then sometimes very scary insights like, there's so much power here, like, are these guys, is this the devil, or these sorts of thoughts, like there's so much power here, is this like, what's going on here, is this whole thing like a CIA experiment, or is this I mean really like these because there was incredible power and energy, and yeah, so lots of different, it could go in many different directions. It wasn't always just yeehaw, experiencing the world as one. That experience of expansiveness can be quite destructive to your sense of identity, in a positive sense in the long run, but it can also be too much, and you can be like, oh, but it led me to many people would say, when your time is done, and I followed them pretty much through 89 the spring. And one day I was in California. I planned on moving there because that was kind of like, if you were a deadhead, that was a cool place to end up being. And so I'd gone out there, and instead of getting a job, I ended up just seeing a bunch of concerts. And remember one particular time in April of 1989, I was just like, all right, I've gotten enough. And I took a bus back to Arkansas and, enrolled in college. And it was like, it had given me what I could have. But, but it was an incredibly powerful way of opening up to realities and community, but it was not without risk. It could go in many different directions because there was nobody orchestrating the whole thing. There was no like ground or nobody to say, all right, this is what you need to do, or a path. It was I mean, it's the first place I encountered Buddhism was at a Grateful Dead parking lot. So it was just full of mystery. Hare Krishnas were there, Buddhists, all these musicians playing music everywhere, just a bazaar everywhere, people selling sandwiches out of their cars. And just it was kind of a open society in a sense.
I guess
I'm not sure what your question was. I apologize, but I was just
no, I mean, I'm not even sure there was a question. I think it's so interesting to hear this, and interesting to hear that you could be immersed in it for so long and then just come to the realization like, I've gotten what I need from it. I'm kind of curious, we're in this moment of like, the psychedelic renaissance right now, where the research is starting up again and public interest is starting. Everybody's reading Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. And, you've mentioned a couple of times that things could go in different directions, that there's maybe, the potential for a darker side to it. And that's definitely not what I'm here. I mean, obviously I'm tuned into the psychedelic advocates. So I'm not hearing, what is there a cautionary tale that you feel like you want to, or advice that you want to give people now from your time having seen both sides of it?
I guess one is just know how much you're taking.
That sounds helpful.
I mean, it wasn't standardized, so if it was legal, you would know, and you could, so I'm a proponent of legalizing things like that, because I think it would be a lot safer. People are going to do stuff anyhow. And I don't want to get into the pros and cons of that kind of argument, but one is just know how much you're taking. And Two, be in a safe environment, because it's going to open you up to things, and including your own neuroses, your own fears. It's going to open you up to a lot, or it can potentially open you up to a lot. And just like in meditation or spiritual development, it's not always pleasant what you're opened up to, and you need to have resources to be able to deal with it. And if you get opened up too fast and you don't have resources, then it can be, you can be quite dependent on others around you to help you or help you out, sort you, guide you, etc. So just have a loving community. And I'm trying to be very careful because it's illegal, so I'm not trying to promote any, anything. But I would say in terms of the psychedelic sort of revolution that's occurring, I'm definitely interested in it, and I think we need to wake up. Yeah, and I feel like, psychedelics could be a part of that. And I'm not really up to date in like the research and how it's being done and legality. I feel like with what's happened with cannabis, it could be possible, for it to be legalized, and then that's a whole different discussion.
And Denver, I think, has decriminalized magic mushrooms. So it seems
from
like
what I understand, there's a few states
that.
it's decriminalized, but you still can't purchase it. I don't know, like you couldn't go to a store and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's the next wave that's coming, perhaps in at least some parts of the world and country.
Yeah.
So I feel like I feel like we have to wake up as a global community, and I see that as a potential part of that. And I'm not, again, involved in it personally or in any of the sort of movements or research, but I'm sort of have an eye open to what's going on. And the Grateful Dead music's made a big comeback in the last 5 years. There's a group called Dead and Company, and I follow them, and not like travel around, but I have a little bit. And there's just a lot of young kids coming, and I don't know, I feel like there's not only that, but globally there's like two things going on. There's like this backwards kind of thing going on, with, for lack of a better word, or closed-mindedness, and tribalism in a negative sense. And there's also this beautiful opening. So I feel like psychedelics could be part of that last sort of thing that's going on, of opening and connecting and reconnecting to the earth, each other, and getting out of some of the rigid constructs perhaps that some of us have had with religion. And just, the Dalai Lama says, his religion is kindness. And I feel like if we're going to survive, we have to all have that as our basic religion, in a sense. I'm not putting down any religions, but a common ethic. And I think it needs to be based on kindness. And I think that psychedelics are in no means necessary, but could be possibly beneficial for some individuals or communities, particularly the research that's being done, for instance, in the therapeutic uses of psychedelics, which again, I'm not well read on, but a lot of it is using very low doses, what they call microdoses, which means it's like under the threshold of recreational use. So that's a whole,
like, you might not even be able to feel an effect.
Yeah, the way
you just would have it in your system.
I've heard it is like you might feel a little happier or something, but I don't know. And it's a different way of utilizing psychedelics in my experience. But I could see that as a potentially very positive avenue. And there's been research that people have even taken psychedelics once have, I don't remember the research, lower incidence of domestic violence and all these other things. There's research, just the fact that you have done it once can have positive impacts. And I don't want to, get into that too much, because I haven't read the research directly and got into it. But I think the potential is there for it to be part of a global awakening, but not like it's the answer, without other parameters and discussions and communities and how it would fit in. And is widely known it's part of some native traditions in terms of religious traditions and that kind of thing. So I think there's a history there.
Around the globe, people have been using different types of plants. I mean, since there have been humans.
And then there's the stoned ape hypothesis coming through Terence McKenna that kind of laughed at in the early 70s, that like in sometime during evolution in the foraging periods, people were eating psilocybin mushrooms, and those particular people evolved at
their
a faster
brains
rate.
Developed, and
so the advances in civilization are a result of the stoned apes, but I don't know
Yeah.
about all of that, but
I think it's
I think it's
difficult to
part of
make a
human.
rigorous claim for that.
Yeah, yeah, but
And
I
for
feel like
anything really, for so
right,
long ago, and we don't
right,
have a lot of evidence
right.
for it, but it is an interesting thing to think about.
But I do feel like there's some community and some bliss and some
Mm-hmm.
opening, awakening aspects of it, sort of coming through the hippie culture that really was in a very white sort of middle class way. So I'm not saying that's the answer for the world, but
Yeah.
for particular, those of us in particular cultural backgrounds, I think it was introducing us to ways of living and thinking about the world that were connecting maybe to pre-industrial or ways of living and living together and celebrating and communing and other things.
A lot that our society and our culture has kind of left by the wayside. And part of what I find really interesting about this moment in terms of the interest in psychedelics is like, back in the 50s and 60s, it seems to me, just from reading the histories, like, so much of the emphasis on the spiritual life was on psychedelics, that people were taking this and was opening their minds. And now, I mean, yoga and meditation have been huge for at least a decade. There's
Yeah,
just all these different sort of containers for holding a spiritual life. And when you
right.
see this psychedelic option as one option among all those, and using meditation for integration, because what are you going to do with these experiences once you've had them? It just seems like we could be entering a very different type of conversation around psychedelics now than there was in the late 60s and early 70s when, like you're saying, like there was a lot of positive, but there was also maybe a lot of like irresponsible, just like, here you go, here's a super
Yeah,
high dose of LSD, let's just see what happens.
a lot of
um
naivety, if I can
mhm.
say that. Naiveness, that's not the correct word.
Yeah,
I can't even say it.
naivety, that
Yeah,
word.
and a lot of, yeah, I mean, people were jumping in and sort of shattering
Yeah.
the belief systems and the culture in a sense around them. And
Yeah.
I see those people in a way as, breaking down some barriers that, and anytime you jump in and break down barriers, there's some risk involved, I think.
Yeah.
So it wasn't necessarily, pie in the sky good times necessarily for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Um, just kind of having this discussion about now the context for psychedelics, it makes me kind of want to pick your story back up because you mentioned, being introduced to Buddhism and Hare Krishnas, all these different things, in the Grateful Dead scene. And I know that now you're a therapist, you're teaching people how to be counselors, you're a Buddhist instructor and a compassion cultivation training instructor. Like what was the sort of through line between those early psychedelic experiences and
Yeah.
now?
Well, I ended up going to a small liberal arts college here in Arkansas after this experience. So this would have been 1993. I was like after my 1990. When did I go? I started in the fall of 1990. So I took basically 4 years off
Mm-hmm.
college, and I was kind of not out there, but I had like a lot of confidence. Like I've seen some things, and I like want to figure
Mm-hmm.
out like what this all means. At that age, I had not read philosophy or had no background in anything except I had a book that this person, the hippie deadhead community, really took care of one another. And
Mm.
one time I was taking a train to San Francisco Bay Area for New Year's Eve concerts for the great, and that was like a big sort of deal if you could. And they had their own mail order ticket system, so you could bypass Ticketmaster and stuff.
Oh,
You actually
wow.
had to go to the post office and fill out this card and put it in the mail at a certain day, postmarked a certain day for how many tickets and put cash in it. No, a postal money order. And it was kind of a lottery. And so if you went
Mm.
to like a tour, you would go get your tickets ahead of time. But like the New Year's shows were like, it was kind of like a crapshoot. But anyhow, I got tickets that year. And so I went by myself on a train out there. And I remember having Christmas meal on the train with some woman and her kids from Orange County. I'm not like making stereotypes of Orange County. And I'm just like pretty raw. And they put me at this table with these people. And I just remember the conversation, just as this poor lady was like, oh my gosh, like Christmas Eve, where are you going? Well, I'm going to see the Great Lake. Well, Dad and her kids, she's like, well, kids, don't worry, he's safe or whatever. And
right. I'm gonna cover their ears now.
And then there was this hippie bus line called the Green Tortoise, I believe, that
oh man,
I took a bus from LA to San Francisco, and like they didn't have seats, and you like sat in couches and talked to each other, and people smoked, and somehow somebody told me about that. So I was taking the Green Tortoise, and older hippies would usually take care of younger people, like who were kind of on the edge. And somebody probably saw me as that, and this guy came and I just remember he talked to me for like 3 hours, just where are you going, and giving me advice about the Bay Area. It can be pretty dangerous, do this and this. And he handed me this book, The Wisdom of Insecurity by Alan Watts. And I didn't read it, but I carried it around and somehow made it back home with it and started reading it before I was going back into college. And I didn't really understand it, but I was searching for something that could help me make sense of these experiences other than just going to concerts. Like, what does this all mean? And I didn't know the difference between Hare Krishna and a Buddhist and a Hindu, I didn't have no reference point.
Yeah.
But I started going to bookstores in Little Rock, and I found a book. What's her name? Alexandra. She went to Tibet in the 19th.
Oh yeah, Alexander David Neal.
And I read her books, and I was like, oh my gosh, I want some of this. But I still had no reference point because it was very, a different world. And I went to college.
Hardly anything would have been actually out there published and like reputable, dependable about Tibetan Buddhism at that time.
And definitely not in a bookstore in Little Rock, Arkansas. So,
right.
So I went to Hendrix College, and my faculty advisor, Dr. Peg Falls Corbett, who was philosophy, she ended up being my philosophy mentor. They assigned, and I was like, I want to get and I'd read the Tao of Physics, Capra's book. So I was like, I want to be a double major in philosophy and physics. That's what I told her. And she goes, okay. And so she signed me up, and she goes, I really want you to take this class with this other guy called Varieties of Christianity, Jay McDaniel. I was like, Christianity, like that wasn't on my radar yet at all. And so I was taking physics classes, which lasted like a whole year. I could ace the math and stuff. I did really well, but like the engineering stuff, like the experiments, I had no interest. I was like asking all these questions about what does it all mean? Oh, because I'd read the Tao of Physics, all the quantum stuff about reality, and they're like, you need to just go back to the philosophy building. And anyhow, Jay taught this course, and he taught the varieties of like Christianity from a global perspective, African versions, and I remember after class one day, I was just like, well, talking about my experiences, what is Christianity? I've experienced all this, and he's like, well, oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I'm really interested in the intersection of spirituality and music. And, I was at Woodstock, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this guy's cool. I thought he was this little geeky Christian professor. And then the next semester he was teaching Introduction to Buddhism.
Oh.
And so I had in my mind that Buddhism was like this exotic. I'd read Alexander David Neal's stuff, just, and it's all about all the exotic aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, basically, first-hand stories.
Yeah.
And then, we read like the Four Noble Truths and stuff, and I was like, it was like this feeling of somebody shooting it straight. Like I had this feeling. And then he had a mentor, a Zen Roshi Fukushima, who was in the Rinzai sect in Japan, who would come once Jay had taught him English, I believe, when he done a time period when Jay was a grad student, but they had a lifelong connection, and Roshi had taught him to meditate. And so I really learned formal Zen meditation from a Zen Fukushima Roshi, high, authentic meditation. And Jay also practices Zen. So I think just in and of itself, that taught me this guy's a Christian and he's teaching meditation. And I had this other book I just started like, there's something here I want to explore, this religion or this, I want some of that. But in my mind, I was like, I'm going to get enlightened kind of thing. Like,
right.
24, like I'm going to do this. Like I'm going to get enlightened. Like, and so
it's age appropriate. I had the same experience when I was like, I don't know, 20 or 22 or something. I was like, this should take 6 to 9 months, and I should become enlightened.
So I was trying to meditate, but it hurt like hell.
Yeah.
And in that type of meditation, you're supposed to sit, you're basically completely motionless for 45-minute sessions. And my mistake or benefit or the first, I was like, I'm gonna get enlightened. So I registered to do like it was either a weekend or a week retreat with Roshi when he was here. And like the physical pain and the torment in my mind, I was in pure agony. And but I was also intrigued. I was like, these people have something I want.
Yeah.
So I started driving to Memphis. My philosophy professor told me about a bookstore there for philosophy books.
How far is that?
2.5 hours.
Dang, that's
So
devotion.
I would drive there every 3 or 4 months and buy a big stack of books, philosophy, and then they had a Buddhism section, and I discovered the Dalai Lama there, and I got so I started, but I was still looking for the exotic part. I think I was like, this sitting stuff is too hard, I want I want some of this magical stuff, like, and it made sense to me with my psychedelic experience. Like I want the magic, and but I was reading the Dalai Lama, and I was like, all right, these the same feeling I had with the Grateful Dead. I was like, they're either onto the whole truth or the whole thing is like a sham. I couldn't, because I was reading and I started Snowline just began, so I was ordering the Snowline catalog in the mail, and I was ordering from them as well. I got Anne Klein's early books on epistemology and Jeffrey Hopkins. They had this whole curriculum they were trying to do in the West to mirror like a Geshe or something.
Yeah.
And so I was buying all these academic books. I still have them. I'm looking up at my bookshelf, like debating Tibetan Buddhism and Anne's stuff on epistemology and all the Dalai Lama's books. And then I got the Kala Chakra book, Jeffrey Hopkins, and it was just like, because I'd read somewhere the fastest path to enlightenment is Kala Chakra. So I ordered that book and I'm reading it, and I'm like, it's all this stuff about initiation and cleaning your shrine and stuff. I was like,
it's also incredibly complex.
Yeah. So I had no reference point, but I was soaking in all this information from books and trying to figure out, is this even the same religion? Because I was also reading Sharon Salzberg's early book, Loving Kindness, came out in that time sometime. Jack Kornfield's Path of the Heart. So I was reading, and I was like, is this even the same religion? And I wasn't, I was like, or is this like a made up religion, the tantric stuff? But I was intrigued. And then I moved to Texas and saw an ad for and then there wasn't internet, so there wasn't like a lot of opportunity in the South. There were no opportunities like to go see what this is about, or at least on my radar. And I saw a flyer somewhere in Dallas about a meditation in the Tibetan Kagyu tradition, and I'd been reading.
Oh yeah, there's a center out there.
Oye Nadahal on like these experiences he had with the Karmapa, and I was like, I want some of that, because that's like, it synced with my other, and it seemed fast and easy, and and then they were having that whole Karmapa controversy, and there was all this tantric stuff, but I didn't have any context for even knowing what we were doing in the rituals and stuff. And then I was kind of freaked out, because I was like, all right, if these people are enlightened, and I'm not putting any tradition down, I'm just talking about my experience. It was like, why can't they figure out who the Karmapa is? So I have this sense
there was a
of
succession, like the Karmapas, they have to recognize reincarnations. It got complicated. Right. It's a long story.
And I'd read the books of I think it's Nada Hall. I don't know how to say it. He ended up being on one side, and the place I was in was on the other, and it got kind of scary to me in a sense. And also, and I just kind of decided I'm going to do it on my own. I've heard Anne Klein talk about Buddhist, but the whole time the Zazen stuck with me. I didn't develop a daily meditation, but I would come back to it. And I remember I started having feelings of, I can do this. But at the same time, I didn't have a reference point, like how long I should be doing it. And I sort of had this rule system in my head of, if I'm only doing it 15 minutes, am I a bad person? All these.
Yeah.
And then I gradually, more books started coming out. I read Robert Thurman's, I think it was his first book, The Central Philosophy of Tibet, which was Tsongkhapa, not his long rim, but a medium level or something. And I started reading his stuff, and it started to make, not that I understood it, but, and then the mention of Dalai Lama just coming back to compassion all the time. At some point I was like, I trust this man, and started reading more and more of him. And and he would refer to Chandrakirti, and that Chandrakirti paid an homage to compassion rather than the traditional. And I was like, there's something there I want that. So I saw it as
like you're drawn more to that compassion, the emphasis on compassion.
And I think that was a need for being grounded, because I was already kind of out there. And then, I started found teachers and went to retreats, and stuck with the Zazen, and it started to work a little bit. Developed a daily practice, and just kept reading books, basically. Still thinking I was going to get enlightened, just like kind of reading these Tibetan philosophical books.
And to be fair, that is the language of the tradition. In Zen, they talk about like you sit in the right posture and you are Buddha. Right. And like in the Tibetan tradition, they talk about Dzogchen and, Buddhahood in one lifetime. So it's not like we were just a bunch of crazy Westerners who were like, yeah, no problem.
Yeah. And then in 2006, so I've read I'd read a lot of hundreds of books probably by then. And I'm not that I retained them all, but sort of heavy books in Tibetan Buddhism. And I went to more retreats. I didn't connect with a teacher, but I went to more retreats, and I got, it was all coming back to suffering and equanimity and these things, which I kind of wanted something more, but it felt safe to me or something. There was something I trusted. And then in 2006, I was in my PhD program at University of Arkansas, and financially I was kind of in a tough spot, but somehow I got this large fellowship that allowed me to not work for 4 years and get a PhD. It was essentially through the Walton Foundation. And I was walking through the library the summer of 2006, August, and there was a flyer of Introduction to Tibetan Buddhism, Geshe Thupten Dorji.
Oh,
it was like an undergraduate class. And I'd been, and I was at that time having this sort of existential crisis. And I've been reading all these books, and the books are all saying you need a teacher. And then when the student's ready, the teacher will come, or these kind of things. I was like, well, maybe I'm never going to be ready, or maybe I'm just going to like be reading books my whole life. I mean, I knew that I needed something. And the class was full, and I didn't have money at the time, but somehow I emailed Sidney Burris, who was the person who brought Geshe there. He was director of Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences, and he put me on a waiting list. And I got an email back like 2 days later saying, you're in the class. And then I didn't have money to pay for it, so I somehow convinced somebody in the university that somehow that class would help me with my PhD curriculum. And then I was just in heaven. Geshe just he doesn't pull punches, even with he's teaching undergraduates or anything. It was like basically the Lamrim tradition from the beginning we read Atish's Lamp to the Path to Enlightenment. And then I started reading Tsongkhapa and Shantideva via the Dalai Lamas. And then
I realized we've said Lamrim a couple of times. Well, you've said Lamrim a couple of times now. Lamrim means like stages of the path.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of like a developmental system where you're going through, from the basic to the more advanced stages of understanding and meditation, stuff like that. It's from the Gelugpa system. So Tsongkhapa, you've mentioned, has one of the most famous presentations of that system.
I forgot this wasn't like a Buddhist conversation.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's us. It's easy to forget.
So they started giving me a framework for like what this tradition is and how you need to move through it. And also a living, breathing person who's a Geshe Narampa or Larampa or something.
Oh yeah, Tharampa, like the highest grade of Geshe degree. It's like a PhD with honors or something.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm still a student, and I went and visited him just a few weeks ago, and I stayed with him, but just like sitting in he would have wins. In addition to teaching at the university, he was supposed to be there one semester. It was like a visiting thing, and then I remember Sydney was asking people in the college if we would write letters to some dean or somebody, saying what a wonderful experience. And he's been there now for 15 years.
Oh, wow.
So just read it, just seeing a living, breathing person and just getting that beat into my head over and over again, the importance of compassion and the basics and karma and compassion. compassion, ethics,
Mm-hmm.
and he and just the fact of his credentials, and then seeing other monks and visiting Tibetans he's always hosting people, and just the respect that they would show to him, because
Mm-hmm.
he's a very like, he doesn't have an entourage, and like
Mm-hmm.
whether you're an undergrad student who never is going to have interest in Buddhism again, or one of his students, or a visiting monk, it's like the same human to human interaction and respect. And
Mm-hmm.
so I learned tons about compassion just watching him, and then going through the 7 points of mind training and these sorts of things
Mm-hmm.
just really gave me a springboard to get in deeper, and then it gave me the springboard to compassion. Meditation's hard.
Mm-hmm.
The visualizing everyone, and well, not even visualizing, just basing a meditation on the fact that other people have been your mother in a past life, and just struggling as a Westerner with, all right, if I don't really totally believe that yet, or like, how
Mm-hmm.
do I work with these practices? And
Mm-hmm.
then uh, I started, just gaining more and more skills, and more resources became available in the culture. And so it's been a process to me since then of really sinking more and more into these, ethics, shamatha, basic breathing meditation, and compassion
Mm-hmm.
practices, and the 4 measurables, and these sorts of things. So to me, it's been a
Mm-hmm.
process of thinking of Buddhism being way out there to just coming back home over and over again.
Yeah. So like
So I,
becoming less exotic and stuff and more
yeah,
just like your way of
so
being.
I'm really, to tie it back to psychedelics, I think that would be a really wonderful, because I have no clue, like, what would a psychedelic experience be in a container of safety and ethics and
Mm-hmm.
discussion, and I could see a lot of possibility there,
Mm-hmm.
because I was kind of doing it free form out in the wild world, and
Mm-hmm.
it was beautiful. And I mean, it's like I have nostalgia about it. I still have chills in my spine. Like, did this really happen?
Mm-hmm.
There was some magic there that I don't think really happened in the West, but that's my own thing, my own belief or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a way to help bring magic back, like Tibetan Buddhism is full of magic. And,
Yeah,
I think when you start diving into the deeper layers of your mind, whether it's through Buddhism or any other tradition, like you just start to realize like the whole thing is made of magic.
yeah.
Like a disenchanted world is fundamentally like not accurate. So it's interesting to
Yeah.
hear you say, like you could see them like going well together.
Buddhism gave me the framework to sort of, not that I live my life in this state of like tapped into magic, but the magic in a sense is worthless if it's not grounded in compassion and ethics to me. So that's where
Yeah,
I think
such a
I
good
think
point.
of I think of tantra as skillful means in this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of us in the West are just looking, not in a bad way, but we need something else, so there's a certain draw to tantric practices and things that I think are similar to the draw of psychedelics in a sense.
Yeah.
So I'm really yeah, psychedelics in a sense led me back
Mm-hmm.
to the ground, or to a sense of the importance of a balance of that, of the sort of
Yeah.
tapping into like the woe-ness of it all, or the mystery and the interconnectedness, and
Yeah.
just that mind and the universe are way more than we think it is,
Yeah.
but it needs some sort of reference point to work with that, or it can like swallow you up, or
Mm-hmm.
become too scary or overwhelming, or
Mm-hmm.
the whole spiritual bypassing conversation. You can
Yeah.
bypass you bypass my own needs and wants and pains, and go there, and not really be addressing the core
Yeah.
aspects of ego, or whatever you want to call that Buddhism is really designed to address.
Yeah, like trying to skip straight to enlightenment, but then there's
Yes.
all this work left undone,
Yeah,
like all your
exactly.
psychological stuff is unprocessed.
Right.
It's kind of the idea of spiritual
Yeah.
bypassing. And
Yeah.
I think
So
that's been
I'm
the critique for a long time of
yeah,
psychedelics is like, oh, people just want the high,
right.
but what you're talking about, like if there's a context and a container of the ethics and the emphasis on, karma and mindfulness and all that kind of stuff, it's not just about the high.
But I will also say, I mean, I know people who, and of people, and know people who, have never practice a form of religion or practice at all, who have sort of come out of that community, who are, as ethical, kind, enlightened people as anyone else I know. So I don't want to like be making the claim that a particular type of religious practice needs to be pursued or something like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. That's not what I meant, but I think sometimes, it's easy to go in that direction, or think like, oh, Buddhism's more compatible with psychedelics than Christianity or something. Like, we just happen to be Buddhist.
Like what I've gotten out of Buddhism, I could see someone else getting just out of a loving community, not necessarily with religious practices involved in it or something like that. But I do feel like the sort of openness should be balanced with some sort of groundedness and connection and community, and
it feels to me sometimes, reading the new psychedelic literature and people's experiences and stuff like that, and like, it feels to me like a lot of us really have the grounding part down, like, I know that for me, I was introduced at around 20, to Buddhism, and that kind of took me on a different path, but like, science, history, like all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's where I feel comfortable. That's like a home base. And if you start talking about all this crazy stuff like Tantra and psychedelics and whatever, from that space, if you've only got the grounding, it's really hard to imagine how the world is made of magic. And I think we as Westerners, I say this having spent a lot of time in other cultures, like especially the Thai culture, and even more than that, the Tibetan culture, they were raised in a different world. And I think it's like really hard for us sometimes to realize how deeply we're conditioned not to recognize magic. And the capability of like, setting aside a weekend, doing a psychedelic journey, and having the world crack open into magic. I think it could be useful for our society in a way. Like, it seems to be like the vitamin we're running lowest on.
I mean, I think it's almost necessary, but then again, I don't have a firm idea of what the logistics would need to be to make that safe and doable. I don't, but I think we need magic, and we need to connect with the world, the earth, and all the realities, for lack of a better term, that we're embedded in. They're way bigger and more mysterious than sort of the culture we've constructed over the past 500 years or 400 years or what have you, depending on how you look at that.
And if you think about like all traditional Buddhist traditions, Thailand or Tibet or China or Japan, like wherever, they all lived in that world. And it's Western Buddhism that's trying to kind of like domesticate the Dharma and take these magical portions out. And I'm just thinking of this, like hearing you describe it, that we, I don't want Western Buddhism to become this like dry, gray, denatured Buddhism. And it'd be nice to have some option for bringing the magic back.
I had a conversation, I don't want to say the person's name, but yesterday with a person from an Asian country who's over here and has been practicing Western Buddhism, and this person expressed concerns similar to what you're expressing.
And I want to say, having said that in the context of psychedelics, I really value that about Asian cultural traditions of Buddhism. I know it's kind of popular in the West to be like, oh, that's just cultural, blah, blah, superstition, whatever. I think it's actually really valuable. But I think when we as Westerners, or for me anyway, I'll speak from my personal experience, when I as a Westerner just try to import the Tibetan version of magic, it doesn't really suit our culture. So if there's a culture, if there's a way that we can understand to crack open.
Well, the Dead and Company are going to be playing in Houston in 2 weeks from today, so go check them
really?
out. Just go to the parking lot if you're in the Houston area, and
just put a finger up and ask for some LSD.
Just a little bit of that magic is there, not in terms of the drugs, just in terms of the young people and the kind of bizarre, not in weird, in like a medieval.
BAZAAR.
It's not as large. It's more localized. It's everything now with capitalism and everything's more controlled, but there's still a little bit of that energy there, and it's and the music is there, and anyhow, so I have a lot of hope. I think getting together and dancing and having community rites of celebration
yes
is we desperately need that, and I'm not putting down sports, but we get that by football games or baseball games or political rallies, but there's
it's all about competition or
competition, and there's something about a community celebrating together that to me was part of the psychedelic experience, that with or without psychedelics, I think we could learn from that. And celebrate our community and the earth and our local communities. And
wow, this is not where I pictured this conversation ending up, but like I suddenly feel so optimistic.
Well, to my experience, one of the things psychedelics opens you up to is, one, just the magic and realities that aren't always like comforting necessarily, but just the fact that there's realities there, energies, however you want to put it, that are way bigger than our sort of paradigms. But there's also this sort of interpersonal connectedness that you experience, that like that our self is really an interrelated self. The Dalai Lama says the two sort of important things we need are, interconnectedness and sort of compassion or kindness sometimes, or something like that. And I feel like psychedelics, or even other ways of feeling interconnected, not only as a community but to the earth, are part of the psychedelic experience for me. It's not just like me as a person taking it, this is what happens in my brain, but it's more like me as a person takes it, and this is how I get out of my brain into this other reality, which is not just my delusions or me experiencing reality, but it's also me being part of this interconnection. And that's where with some of the tantric practices and approaches, it seems very consistent, but in a very, obviously more structured, time-tested approach. Some of which I don't know if really conducive to Westerners even implementing, but that's a whole different story. And I had something else I was going to say, but I lost it.
It's been such a rich conversation, and like for as long as I've known you, I just learned so much. I really appreciate, your being willing to like share what sound like some really precious and like vivid experiences that you had.
Yeah, and I have to say, part of it is the sort of resurgence of the Grateful Dead community in the past 5 years. Jerry Garcia died in 1995, and there was really kind of like, if a great leader of a therapy program or anything dies, there's sort of infighting and a lot of grieving. I think it doesn't make any sense to when I never met. The level of grief I had personally was deeper than anything. And so I would sit there and sometimes watch YouTube videos. That's another, people were recording these concerts in the 70s and 80s, so you can actually go physically. And there's archivists. There's a whole program at UC Santa Cruz are archiving the whole experience and getting first. Anyhow, after they had a reunion concert in 2015, so it would have been 20 years after Jerry Garcia died. It would have been their 50th anniversary as a band. And something happened after that, at least for me personally, and it seems it's like the grief, we went through the grieving process, and then the band members said, this is the last time we're all playing, but 3 of them started another band, and there's a new young energy, and there's all these cover bands all over the country. And it's similar to jazz in the sense that like the older generation and the younger generation musically are having this dialogue now, and there's a sense of resurgence and podcasts. And to me, some of the beauty of the movement, or whatever you want to call it, that was sort of only part of the story, because there was also a lot of darkness and risk and other things. But I feel like there's this beautiful resurgence going on right now, and I can feel it. And the interpersonal mind, and I don't want to get into Jerry Garcia, but I feel like his music is going to be around longer than I'm going to be around, I'll put it that way.
Man, what an impact he's had on so many lives.
And just that whole thing, the whole community hippie thing, for lack of a better term. Yeah, I believe the hippies were right in a certain sense.
Yeah, yeah. It feels like we have an opportunity to take what was good about the hippie movement
The
and
idea of
repurpose it.
celebrating community,
Mm-hmm.
questioning authority when we need to,
Yeah,
questioning social norms when we need to,
yeah,
live and let live as long as you're not harming someone else, be kind to one another, take care of one another. To me, that's the ethos we need
yeah,
to really survive. I mean, in a certain
yeah.
sense.
And let the magic back in.
And it has to happen on a community level. It can't be just like big concerts, you know, it has to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
ultimately happen on a community level.
But now look at the infrastructure we have for creating community. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so much greater than it was, back in the 80s or
Right.
70s.
So I could, going back to Buddhism, I could see some sort of, combination of Buddhist practices and ethics, but also embedded with dance and
Mm.
fun, and that's
Mm-hmm.
going on a little bit. What is Sharon Salzberg tells the story of teaching with Ram Dass, and they're co-teaching, and Ram Dass is like, man, you Buddhists are really lazy. I mean, not lazy, really boring. And, his
No
part is
dancing.
a lot of clapping and singing and stuff. So
Yeah.
I think to me that's the paradigm of an ethic moving forward. There's this
Mm-hmm.
austerity and this groundingness and this
Mm-hmm.
breathing practice, however that manifests for people, not necessarily meditation, but then this other aspect of tapping into magic and community.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, for me, psychedelics was more on that side, but also the grounding side as well,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of just stripping
Mm-hmm.
away the sort of stories and sort of false identity, or whatever you want to call that, just the
Mm-hmm.
constructs, worldview or view that we all have that we're probably not aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, I guess we kind of just covered this, but if you were to essentialize like your hopes for what psychedelics could offer us now, like what would be your like one or two biggest aspirations for the moment?
Well, one, there's a Grateful Dead lyric, believe it if you need it, if you don't just pass it on. So one, it's not an answer. It's not like everybody should be taking LSD or mushrooms. I
Right.
mean,
Right.
but I believe that it could be used as a possible tool for just tapping into magic and community and opening our minds to reality that's much bigger than what we are. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
like it's just buried under the surface. I've been reading and working some with 14th through 16th century Christian mystics, and there was so much magic there, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
tapping in. I'm not like a scholar or a deep practitioner, but I've been just reading a lot and doing some of the
Mm-hmm.
practices. We sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater
Yeah.
for some good reasons, but we need to. Which do we want? We want the baby or the bathwater one back? I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Maybe we can recover that baby.
We need a sense of magic. Yeah, recover the baby and leave the bathwater out or something.
Exactly.
And the baby's like wanting us to take care of one another and survive and
Yeah.
enjoy life. And
Yeah.
that's what I love about Mahayana approach, this idea of bliss.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Thurman's been talking a lot about bliss lately. Just bliss is connected to compassion and wisdom, or what have you. It's not like we either have bliss or we have
Yeah.
ethics. We can have a blissful way of pursuing ethics and community and interconnectedness. I didn't say that very eloquently or authentically in terms of the tradition, but Buddhism has helped me sort of tap into bliss again
Mm.
that I didn't think was possible.
Mm.
And yeah, and I
That's
think
beautiful.
psychedelics could be a potential in a controlled setting, or
Mm-hmm.
dealing with sort of issues of legality. I think it could be a potential powerful tool for getting in touch with that bliss, sense of
Mm-hmm.
magic, connectedness, etc.
Yeah. You listened all the way to the end. Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or like and subscribe. May you and all beings be well.